Good evening. I invite you to take your seats. Welcome, everyone. My name is Brittany McGee, and I'm the Next Generation Officer here at the Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our Young Professionals program, discussing American sentiment on foreign policy and the Council's most recent public opinion survey, America Engaged. We're in for an extremely informative and rather timely discussion tonight, and happy that you made it out to join us. A very special welcome to our guests from the University of Chicago Committee on International Relations, and to all newcomers to our conference center tonight. Welcome to the Council. Most of you know the House rules, but for our new friends, tonight's program is on the record and being live streamed, so please silence your phones, but keep them out, as we will be taking questions through our online survey technology, the link to which you can find on the screen on either side of me. Simply type chi.cnf.io into your device browser and select tonight's program to submit your questions for consideration. We very much welcome your engagement with us on social media and encourage you to tag #CouncilYP in your posts. As you're tweeting, though, know that views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. We engage not only the nation's and world's top leaders, but also Chicago's next generation of leaders, with programming to increase your global fluency and cultural competence. I encourage you, if you're not already a member with us, to join and participate in our Young Professionals Network. To find out more, you can visit one of our Young Professional ambassadors right on the side of the room following the program. This program is part of the newly established Lester Crown Center on U.S. Foreign Policy. The generous gift from the Crown family supports all of the center's work, including the development of the 2018 Council Survey. Copies of the survey can be found on tables across the room as well as on your way out. I know a few of you have picked them up already. And to help us unpack some of the findings in the survey and analyze their potential impact on foreign policy going forward, we have an incredible panel of experts. To introduce them briefly, Daalder is president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He previously served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013, and also served on the National Security Council staff as Director for European Affairs from 1995 to 1997. Ivo is the author and editor of 10 books, including recently published The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership. He was educated at the universities of Kent, Oxford, and Georgetown, and received his PhD in political science from MIT. Dina Smeltz is the Senior Fellow for Public Opinion and Foreign Policy at the Council. She oversees the Council's annual survey and directs the Council's collaboration with various international research organizations. Dina previously served as the Director of Research in the Middle East and South Asia Division and as Director of the European Division in the U.S. State Department Bureau of Intelligence and Research. She holds an MA from the University of Michigan and a BS from Pennsylvania State University. Michael Desch is the Director of the International Security Center at the University of Notre Dame. He has previously worked as a staffer in the U.S. Senate, in the U.S. State Department Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and in the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service. Desch holds a BA from Marquette University and received a master's and doctorate from the University of Chicago. From CIR in the audience tonight. And moderating tonight's discussion is Peter Slevin. Peter is an associate professor at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. Previously, he was European bureau chief at the Miami Herald and spent many years at the Washington Post writing on U.S. foreign policy. He has an undergraduate degree from Princeton and a Master of Philosophy and International Relations from Oxford. To set the stage for our conversation tonight before we begin, join me in watching a short video on the 2018 Council Survey, America Engaged.
The Trump administration has made bold attempts to reshape U.S. foreign policy. Is the American public on board? President Trump touts unilateralist policies, yet 7 in 10 Americans support the U.S. taking an active part in world affairs. and a striking majority say it is more effective for the U.S. to work with allies and other countries to achieve foreign policy goals. The president has strained relations with U.S. allies in Europe and Asia, and Americans are worried about those relationships. 57% say the U.S. has lost allies over the last year. The public still supports the transatlantic alliance. More Americans than ever favor increasing U.S. commitment to NATO. And Americans increasingly want to double down on relations with South Korea and Japan. The administration pulled out of the Iran deal and Paris Agreement. Meanwhile, majorities of the public say the U.S. should participate in both. And in fact, support has increased over the past year. The White House has opened up trade battles on multiple fronts, while the American public is more positive about the benefits of trade than ever before, saying that trade is good for the U.S. economy, consumers, and job creation. What else is the public thinking about President Trump's vision of the U.S. and its role in the world? To find out, explore the report at thechicagocouncil.org/survey.
So thank you, everybody, for being here for this, and thanks to Brittany for the introductions. It is, the title of the survey is a giveaway, America Engaged. It tells you what people are thinking these days. Among the things that are so striking to me, just looking at it for the first time the other day, was that the percentage of people in this country who favor engagement is among the highest recorded in the survey. The only time that was higher was right after 9/11. This despite what we've been hearing over the last couple of years. And 91% of the people who responded said the United States is more effective when it works with allies. So yay multilateralism, I suppose, is the early theme. When I was on my way here, I ran into a neighbor, and he said, "Hey, where are you headed?" And I said, "Well, I'm going down to the Chicago Council, and we're going to talk about foreign policy." And he said, "Well, what foreign policy?" And I said, "Well, you know, U.S. foreign policy." He said, "There is no policy. Nothing makes any sense at all." So we do have an interesting moment, at least in the perspective of some. Before we even talk about numbers, Ivo, is there a U.S. foreign policy that is coherent and unified? Should we set the terms here?
Sure, there is. There's a very clear foreign policy. It happens to be a little different from the foreign policy we've had in previous decades, but there is a very clear foreign policy. I mean, one of the things that Donald Trump has brought to the issue of foreign policy is a very different worldview. In contrast to, I think, 13 of his predecessors, who believed that it was extremely important for the United States to lead, not just for itself, but together with other countries, to achieve the goals that the U.S. needed to achieve, whether that was through building security alliances, building global trade and international economic rules, whether it was in promoting democracy and freedom, and finding ways to do that together with particularly our friends and allies around the world. He has focused on winning. And winning is very different than leading. Winning is a bilateral concept of us versus whoever, and that whoever can be an adversary, or it can be a friend, or in fact our friends now are becoming foes in that description. But it's about short-term achievement of immediate American desires, whether that is to change the trade balance with China or Europe or Canada, or whether it is to achieve some kind of deal with North Korea, which is easy to do if you have a summit with the leader of North Korea, or whether it is to reimpose sanctions on Iran, and you will then get a better deal out of it. But it is this bilateralism rather than multilateralism or internationalism that is the defining element of his foreign policy. And frankly, that's how he has viewed the world for about 30 years. It's not that different. What is different is in comparison to his predecessors. He has actually been quite consistent, and I think he's going to continue that foreign policy for at least the next 2 years.
Michael, do you see this as a kind of a split screen, winning leadership? Is he not leading internationally?
Well, I think Ivo is right that 2016 marked an important watershed in terms of how we thought about the world. I'm a little less willing to personalize it with Donald Trump, although, as president of the United States and somebody with a strong personality, you can't exact that from the equation. But I sort of see where we are today in 2018 as a confluence of two things. On the one hand, there's President Trump, who I think does have a very consistent foreign policy. And by the way, it's the same as his domestic policy, which is doing what makes him look good. And that can be different things at different times. But behind that, there are some tectonic plates that have shifted that I think opened up space for somebody like Trump to come into office. And if Trump were to get hit by a bus tomorrow, it's not clear to me that we still wouldn't be talking about a very different world in which we operate. And a lot of we'll get to it, we talk about some of the specific things in the survey. But I think, just to sort of poke Ivo a little bit, I think there's sort of an element in this that, geez, maybe Trump didn't succeed as much as we feared, and that we'll be back to normal in 2 years. I want to put down a marker today and say we're never going back to normal. The old internationalist status quo is going to change irrevocably. Now, it doesn't mean that Donald Trump is the face of a new approach to American engagement in the world, but it's going to look very different. It'll look very different because there'll be new actors, and it'll look very different because the whole relationship between domestic politics and international politics has changed in a fundamental way.
That is pretty intriguing and a lot to dig into. Dina, on Michael's argument that the domestic side of things is shifting dramatically and that will influence U.S. decisions about alliances, internationalism versus a different set, a different rubric. What do the numbers show you? Is that in line with what you're hearing?
So for several years now, those issues that are the most partisan and the most conflictual among the American public are those that cross international and domestic politics, like trade and immigration. And I do think that if we didn't have this president, perhaps the issue of immigration wouldn't be used so much as a political football. And in the past, Republicans and Democrats have been able to work on bills to address it in a more positive way. So, but perhaps there is a new path with this president that has been blown up. I'm not sure where I fall on that, but certainly there is more of a connection. And also the world is just connected so globally now that, a speech made for a domestic audience will still get played internationally. So yeah, I think the surveys hold up on that, with that idea that domestic and international aren't as easily dissected, but at the same time, on a lot of broader international questions, like alliances, like support for sending troops somewhere, average American voters generally kind of outsource the decisions to foreign policy elites and decision makers. They take sort of a shortcut and trust that the leaders that they elect will make the decisions best for them. So in terms of grander schema, Americans aren't as involved, but trade and immigration, because whether it's true or not, people believe it affects them personally. That is one of the hot button issues.
Because the survey certainly seems to suggest that most Americans believe in international connections. You could say they're internationalists in the sense of believing in allies, believing in trade, recognizing a certain sort of global universe, but maybe issue by issue is where things may break down in the future. I don't know. I'm curious, Michael, to hear more about the notion that we won't go back after Donald Trump, that there will be, that something has shifted. What is that?
Well, I think, a couple of things have shifted. One is the period of unipolarity, the unique position from, the early 1990s, until quite recently is inevitably going to end. And it'll be just structurally, the distribution of power will be very different. So the idea that the United States could be, as Madeleine Albright said in the 90s, the indispensable nation, which was plausible then, certainly will not be plausible in the future. But secondly, to talk about one of the issues that Dina raised, which is trade policy, what I saw in some of the results was quite interesting, and it reflected a very striking sort of nuance. Because I think, we live in a world now where economic activity is global, and I think even Donald Trump recognizes that. He's not an advocate of autarky. He believes in trade. He just doesn't. He believes in what he calls fair trade, not trade under multilateral arrangements that he thinks are disadvantageous to the United States. And I think most Americans recognize that. On the other hand, it was interesting in, I think, in the second appendix when Dina and her colleagues reported, some of the priorities of the American public. Protecting jobs is like number 2. Now, this is the Trump international economic policy agenda. So I think the public holds those two things, and there is tensions between them. But I think that, we could go down the list of the findings, top lines, and then find other things that seem to be in tension with it. And when I say that I think we're moving into a new world, it's precisely those tensions between sort of the, many of the pillar positions of the, the previous internationalist foreign policy and where I think the public is going today.
Ivo, how do you see that? I mean, especially given your prior role and.
Well, so I agree that, there's structural change that happens. In fact, the unipolar moment really was a moment. It was pretty unique for the United States to emerge out of a 4-decade-long conflict with the Soviet Union as the unquestioned power in the world. And at some point, in fact, in part because of the way the United States has conducted its foreign policy, by allowing and encouraging other powers to rise, you were going to have a redistribution of power and the rise of other powers, including, most importantly, China, very much aided, by the way, by U.S. policy to rise in the way it has risen. And that will change the nature of the interaction. Whether it is preordained that the interaction between the United States and China is purely competitive, and only competitive, which is the way that the Trump administration has started to describe it, both in the national security strategy that was issued a year ago, and I think most memorably in Vice President Pence's speech of early October, is a question. I think there are interactions with the Chinese, both economically, as we're trying to put more and more tariffs on trade, but also in a whole variety of other issues, like climate change. Turns out that the climate in the United States is not separable from the climate in China for some reason, and as a result that you need cooperation in order to deal with it. And saying we're no longer cooperating is not going to help you solve this issue. But secondly, and I think this is where we get to sort of the difference between the Trump approach to foreign policy and I think the poll, is if we're going to be in a competitive relationship with China, we better take advantage of the one thing we have and they don't. We have allies, they have clients. And I think what you find in the poll is a recognition of the importance of allies and friends, and bringing people back to our side and trying to figure out how do we compete most effectively. By the way, that's what we did from 1945 until 1990 with regard to the Soviet Union. And if we're going to be in this competitive climate with regard to China, which I think we are moving in a much more competitive situation than we had been in the last 40 years, the one thing we can have that allows us to succeed in that competition is to bring our Asian and European allies along. That's not what the president has done, but in the poll, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, with the exception of what we call Trump Republicans, those who have a highly favorable view of Donald Trump, are all supportive of that traditional strategy, which I think is one most of the American foreign policy elite, by the way, also continues to believe.
You know what's striking, though, in your results was the relatively low salience of the development of China as a world power among threats. And I actually think this is an instance where the establishment, the DC consensus, which is focused on China as a peer competitor, is out of step with the public, for sure. That's what your poll results show. And I think that Trump is closer to this position. His position about China and the China rivalry is it's going to be an economic rivalry. It's not going to be a military rivalry. And there was a real tension in the national security strategy between, sort of his advisors, who I think are part of the peer competitor sort of mindset, and the president, who I think sees China as a different sort of challenge.
Well, and the national security strategy also outlines other threats from China and Russia, which also is not seen as that much of a threat for the public. But I just wanted to underscore something Ivo said, and to link to, if what Mike says is right, that we're never going to have a foreign policy like we have in the past, that things are blown up now and disrupted for good, it's not because of the American public. The American public does have conflicting views on immigration and trade to some extent, but on all the other pillars of American foreign policy, like alliances, trading in general being a good thing for the U.S., international agreements, coming to the defense of allies, which is higher now than it's ever been since we've started polling. For all of those things, the public is still really committed to it. Now, they might not know what their leaders are what path the leaders are taking them down, but it's not a grassroots position to change the foreign policy necessarily.
There seems to be a very well-entrenched notion that the United States can't go it alone, needs alliances, needs allies to solve problems. By the way, the report, America Engaged, is here. If you don't have it already, there's some in the back. And when it comes to China, a very small percentage of people surveyed thought China was a critical threat, even though Xi Jinping was seen quite unfavorably. He only had a 34% favorability rating, although that was more than twice Putin's favorability. And that was significantly higher than Rocket Man's favorability, Kim Jong-un, who was only seen favorably by 6% and 91% unfavorable. In the way that the president defines what has happened to the United States, when he was running for office the first time, the way he conducts foreign policy now, he's always saying, essentially, people have always been kicking sand in our face, nobody respects the United States, China didn't on trade, NATO should be contributing more to its own security, although he seems to imply that NATO should be giving us money. That's a different story. The idea is the United States will not be pushed around anymore. How is that playing, do you think?
Well, I wish we would have asked a question about burden sharing, because I think that issue resonates with people.
We did ask something along those lines, and this happened to have last year's. We asked
the question whether it is more effective. Is that? Go ahead. You got it.
We asked people to choose, do you think the United States should encourage greater allied defense spending through persuasion and diplomatic means while maintaining a firm commitment to defend NATO members? Or should the United States withhold its commitment to defend NATO members until NATO allies actually spend more on defense? And an overall majority of 59% said we should encourage greater spending, but still maintain our commitment.
Well, that's a tactical issue, the question of do you threaten or do you cajole in some ways? I mean, I think if you were to ask the question, just do you think the allies are spending enough on defense? The answer is going to be no. Right. And the answer, that would be the correct answer, by the way. The allies are not spending enough on defense. And as I like to remind anybody who brings this up, this has been true since 1952. We have been complaining about allies not spending enough on defense since Harry Truman was president, who, by the way, was also the one who negotiated the NATO treaty.
Consistent pattern of failure by our NATO ambassadors, who universally failed to get these deadbeats to pony up.
Although it's changing, they're now starting to pay again, and I don't know whether it is a NATO ambassador or whatever. I think it's Vladimir Putin that did this. Just on the China issue, because Mike and everyone, you're absolutely right that I think it was a surprise for us to find that the Washington consensus, which is now bipartisan, it is Democratic and it's the only thing I think Democrats and Republicans in Washington agree on, which is that China is a problem. And a big one and a rising one. I mean, I note that Hank Paulson, who has had a very strong embrace for China for many, many years, has now come out very strongly saying China is a real problem for us. That's not viewed either on the economic side, which is even more surprising, and on the military side. The question is how, is this a lagging indicator? Are we going to see the American public sort of catching up to the rhetoric that we see on the elite level, which again, Democrats and Republicans, if the Chinese thought having the Democrats winning the House is a good thing from perspective of trade, they have something coming their way, because the Democrats pretty much agree with that idea of a strong competition between the two in Washington.
And if you think about the Democratic lineup in 2020, it's pretty clear that trade will be absolutely essential to the way a Democrat positions herself or himself going forward. In terms of the conduct of foreign policy, leaving aside alliances and so on, there is this question that the survey asks: is it better for America to be feared, which would seem to be the Donald Trump approach, military buildup, don't mess with us, you'll pay, or admired? Dina, do you remember what those numbers were? Because it's pretty striking.
So there were two questions, and it's on page 10 if you have the report with you. The first question is, in order to achieve U.S. foreign policy goals internationally, do you think it's more important for the United States to be feared or admired around the world? Taking a page from Machiavelli. So 73% of Americans say it's more important to be admired, 26% say feared. And then we say, okay, today, do you think the United States is more feared or more admired around the world? And more people say feared, 39%, than admired, 20%. And very interestingly, 40% volunteered a separate response that they had to write in themselves. And 13% of that group said that the United States is laughed at, not feared or admired. 4% said disliked. Some say disrespected or weak, but generally on a negative side.
And isn't it interesting, too, that one of the questions is whether is the U.S. more or less respected than 10 years ago? Is the United States more respected than 10 years ago? And the answer was 59% said no.
But an interesting thing about that question is that Americans, every time we've asked that question, have said we're never, it's sort of the Rodney Dangerfield response. They always think we're not respected. But By comparison, and what's interesting is that they do think Russia is more respected today than 10 years ago, and they do think China is more respected today than 10 years ago, but not the United States. Part of that's partisan. You'll see that Republicans think we are, and Democrats think we're not respected. So that also comes through.
In terms of go ahead, Mike. Did you?
Well, I was just going to say, I hope we'll talk more about the increasingly partisan nature of a lot of these responses. I mean, the issue about the consequences of Russian meddling in the election is just one of the more stark illustrations of how political affiliation shapes where you are on these foreign policy issues. And I think that's going to be a harbinger of the future. I don't know that there ever was a true foreign policy in which politics stopped at the water's edge in American history, but certainly things are a lot further away from that ideal today than they have been in previous
And
years.
in terms of public opinion, you can see the partisanship growing. Until 2003, Republicans and Democrats felt very similarly on immigration, on alliances, on sending troops to different places, trade, and since 2003, with the invasion of Iraq, that was the first time where we started to see splits between Republicans and Democrats on whether we should engage in the world, and things like the UN became a very politicized issue. And since 2003, those gaps have only grown.
So I think we need to be careful on this characterization. On the one hand, yes, polarization in foreign policy is the same as it is in domestic policy. And as Dina said, on those particular issues that are both international and domestic, immigration and trade being the most important ones, polarization is deepening over time. That said, and we've done some interesting polling and cross-tabulation, the biggest split is actually not between Democrats and Republicans. The biggest split in the poll this year and last year is between Trump Republicans and everyone else. And a non-Trump Republican, that is Republicans who only have a somewhat or not a favorable view of Donald Trump, are more like independents and Democrats on the major issues of foreign policy than they are like Trump Republicans. And that's an important point. The base, the Trump base that we've heard so much about, is very much with the president, and he can guide it in any way he wants. But the large majority of Americans, including the non-Trump Republicans, as we call them, actually are staying with on non-immigration, non-trade issues, but on alliances, on engagement, on feared versus admired, on are more where the American public and, frankly, American foreign policy has been for a long time.
Yeah.
So what that tells me is you can actually have a continuing internationalist foreign policy. There is an enabling factor in the public that would allow a leader to say, actually, we can be pro-trade, pro-alliances. No one is in favor of dumb wars, turns out. That's true. But a measured foreign policy. And the big debates that we are having, it seems to me, in the academy between restraint and a more traditional foreign policy really fall within that consensus. Where the consensus falls apart is this idea that our allies don't matter, we shouldn't pay any attention to them, that we should have adversarial trade relationships with everybody, not just with the Chinese. And that's, I think, where foreign policy and the public are working at cross purposes.
And I wonder if it's also salient that the poll is being taken at a time when there is no dramatic threat to the United States. That worries about terrorism have declined some. There is no war underway. Putin is a problem in some ways, China is a problem in some ways, but there's no mobilizing factor that would cause people to think maybe super deeply about this. In terms of that consensus, though, I was struck by the same thing in the survey. And for those of you in the audience, how many of you think it's a good idea to pull out of the Iran treaty? No one, not one. What about the Paris Climate Agreement? No fans there. So 2/3 of the respondents in the survey said the same thing, that they favor staying in. And it does make you wonder, post-Trump, whether that consensus, at least in certain partnerships, returns, and can the United States rejoin?
One of the key points of the report is that actually not only does a majority support them, it's higher than it was since Trump pulled out of those agreements.
I think one of them was up 7% over the last year.
Yeah, so in many ways, it's some people possibly paying more attention or forming an opinion that they might not have felt strongly about before, but more people registering their opposition to these withdrawals of treatment.
Mike, what's your take?
I'm of two minds. I mean, I think the one real existential threat that's out there, simmering, pardon the pun, just beneath the surface is concern about the physical consequences of climate change. Clearly. So I could see that coming back. I want to be very clear. I'm a huge supporter of the JCPOA. I think it was as good a treaty as we could have got, and it was unconscionable.
The Iran deal.
The Iran deal that the Trump administration abrogated it. But I think that there was more bipartisan support for torpedoing it than the public opinion polls would indicate. It went down pretty easily because there were a lot of people across the political spectrum for a variety of reasons who regard Iran as sort of public enemy number one. And so that I don't see, getting fixed easily. There was a lot of criticism of the Obama administration, a lot of friendly fire that affected, that I think created a climate in which it was relatively easy to bring down what should have been, in my judgment, a model treaty.
I think of it in a little bit of a different way because in 2017, fear of North Korea shot up. Now it's back down 15 points. But I think people looked at the possibility of North Korea doing something aggressively with their nuclear weapons, and they saw perhaps that because the fear of Iran's nuclear program actually went down. So perhaps some people who, again, were paying attention said, well, actually having an agreement makes us feel safer. And so that could have been why there are some increases now.
I want to turn to your questions. But first, one question about this intersection between domestic politics and foreign policy and perceptions of the United States. There's been considerable attention to the friends Donald Trump has made, the foreign leaders whom he praises, and of course the use of his language by autocrats abroad, fake news. The other day you'll remember that when he was speaking about sending the military to the border because of the fearsome caravan.
Isn't that the caravan of death?
The caravan of death, it could be. Road of Horrors, 900 miles away, 15,000 soldiers. He hasn't tweeted about the caravan since the election. Not sure why that is. But he did say something interesting about the use of force, right? He said that anyone throwing stones at the U.S. military, U.S. installations, should be treated as if they were firing rifles. And in Nigeria, when the Nigerian army the other day fired on Shiite protesters, the Nigerian authorities said, just like Donald Trump said. So does his approach to domestic affairs influence the way the United States is seen abroad, do you all think?
Definitely.
How could it not?
Yeah, surveys have
And what does it
shown-
mean in terms of leadership and the United States leadership of the world, do you think?
Well, one consequence is that it makes it more difficult for certain leaders to work with our president if it's going to hurt them at home domestically, because he is really not viewed with respect in most of our allied countries, I would say.
Yeah, I think if you believe it is important for the United States to be a country that still brings together international coalitions for whatever purpose, whether it's to deal with climate change or it's to deal with a military threat or it's to deal with Chinese predatory trade practices or what have you, how the United States president talks about allied leaders and non-allied leaders is an important aspect in your ability to marshal these coalitions. Now, interest will dictate a lot of what nations do and when, but it becomes more difficult to get a Germany or a Canada to come along with us on a journey that may be contested politically at home when the President of the United States goes out and calls the Canadian Prime Minister weak, terrible, and a liar, and does the same with the German Chancellor, which he has repeatedly done, and particularly when he, at the same time, and I was listening to his press conference yesterday when he was asked about Putin and Crimea. It turns out that this was Obama's fault, not Putin's, because it happened under Obama's regime, and he refused to acknowledge that maybe Vladimir Putin was the one who actually committed the act. It was more important to make the point that it was under Obama's regime. So that has an influence on your ability to lead. And I actually still think the United States is an indispensable power. It is the only country that can create international coalitions, particularly on major issues, because it has that leadership potential. That's being eroded when the way we talk about international leaders, friends and not so friendly countries, has in some way switched over.
Yeah, I never thought I'd live to see the day in which George W. Bush was, held up as a model of statesmanship. But, I think that when you think about it objectively, certainly George W. Bush had, I can't believe I'm saying this either, a more diplomatic Maine while he was in office. But the truth of the matter is that U.S. unilateralism did not begin with Donald Trump. It certainly began with W. But again, the indispensable nation argument, which Madeleine Albright was, famous for uttering, began under the Clinton administration. And my understanding is the Europeans, even with the velvet glove of the, Clinton's more multilateral approach to diplomacy, found that indispensable nation mindset grading. So what I think that shows is that, the power realities shape a lot of things, and the personalities, sort of matter a bit, but, they shouldn't distract us from seeing, how the tectonic plates are really shifting. The period of the post-Cold War era was the period of American unipolarity, and you could have, more diplomatic and, smoother administrations in office, but the reality of American power shaped the world, as will, I think, the reality of the new world that we're moving into, where there are other powers and other issues.
Well, that's a nice segue to some of these great questions that we have. Let me ask one from my trusty little iPad here, and then let's take the next couple directly from the audience. Someone asks whether the survey asked about the war in Afghanistan, speaking of George W. Bush and the U.S. assertion of power. And it's one thing to talk about contributions to NATO and working with other nations on climate change, but what about war making?
Yeah, I wish we had. Our survey's 20 minutes long, which is really, really long for a survey questionnaire. So we have to be careful and choose certain things in certain years to ask, and we switch back and forth. And at the time, Afghanistan wasn't brewing. But yeah, so we didn't ask about that this time.
But we asked it last year or the year before, and the consensus among the American public is our engagement in both Iraq and Afghanistan has been a disaster. By the way, I think an accurate description on both, but
wow, that's right.
Including in Afghanistan, where I spent a lot of time in my NATO years trying to figure out how to make that a better place, but it is a absolute, utter mess. 17 years that we have.
So it says something about definitions of assertiveness and where the United States should act and how.
And what you can use military power to, to achieve. So it's, one thing to, say that, we're willing to use military power to defend important allies conventionally. But it's another thing, for example, to talk about protecting weaker nations against foreign aggression or, promoting democracy and things like that. I think those things are gone for good, or at least gone for a generation.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there a question there? Why don't we start with you on the end, on the green shirt?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Do any of you see United States foreign policy shifting back to what I would call the pre-Trump era once he leaves office? Thank you.
I'm on record. No. Eva's on record. Yes.
I'm on record. Yes. Which is to say, I think it is still possible for the United States to be a country that leads internationally in the shaping, in bringing together coalitions to shape the international environment. It's increasingly difficult for the United States to do that by itself, in part because of the changing distribution of power. But I do think that if we have the continued ability to gain trust and the confidence of our friends and allies, we can still be the most important power internationally with our friends and allies on issues like security, diplomacy, and trade. By the way, if you take the United States and its major allies together, that power together is equal to what the United States represented in terms of power at the end of World War II. It is still 50% of global GDP, more than 50%, and well more than 50% of global military power. So the question is, how do you forge coalitions to make that effective? That is becoming more and more difficult because there is now a growing power on the other side that is trying to pull away these members of your coalition. And so it is more difficult to do it. It's more important to be more diplomatic, to have a larger to have more ambassadors. Be good to, by the way, if you want to try to get the Saudis and the Turks to work with us on certain issues, it'd be good to have an ambassador there. We have no ambassador in either country. And have assistant secretaries and the whole thing that makes diplomacy work. That becomes more important, particularly because military power, I think rightly, as Mike said, is less capable of achieving the things that we thought we were able to achieve when we had more military power than anybody else. And by the way, we failed pretty miserably on that. So it's a question of how you do it. It's going to be different. That I totally agree with Mike. This is not 1990 or 1995 or even 2003. In 2020, the power balance is going to be different. Therefore, more important for us to spend time figuring out how do we get our friends and allies to be on our side rather than on no side, which is where they currently are, or worse, on the other side.
So if I could just pick up on one piece of what Ivo said and his mention of Saudi Arabia, sort of brought to the forefront of my mind the complexity of the world today. Now, Saudi Arabia, for much of the period since the Second World War, was one of the pillars of American foreign policy and national security policy in the Persian Gulf. Today, that particular pillar is really shaky and really wobbly. And a couple of things are going on. You know, one big change is the fact that there have been fundamental changes in the nature of the global energy market, and the relative salience of Persian Gulf oil has changed significantly in recent years. But secondly, the politics of the region have become wickedly complex. I mean, we like to think of the Saudis as the good guys. Now, how we ever, believe that with a straight face, I don't know, because
I was waiting for the second part of that sentence. Yeah,
they haven't been so good, but it's come out of the closet with the events in recent events in Istanbul, which is really sort of terrible given what they've been doing in Yemen, which has killed a far greater number of people. So we want to see our allies as the guys and gals in the white hats or the white keffiyehs, and the bad guys being the black turbans. But it turns out that the people wearing turbans in Iran or the Islamicists in Istanbul are not worse than our allies. And our allies, with allies like those, who needs enemies? So Ivo's right. The fact we don't have an ambassador there is terrible, because we need somebody that can, that can help us make sense of a very, very complex environment. And folks, that's the reality of the world we're moving into. Even the illusion of Saudi Arabia as a reliable ally and a progressive country is gone for good.
What I hear is it's a good time to go into the Foreign Service and get in on the ground floor, because all those embassies are going to have to be staffed in years to come. Who has another question? Yes, ma'am, in the second row, or possibly the third. I guess it's the third row.
Third row. To sort of follow up on that, we haven't talked about the increasing right wing of our allies, and sort of what it may not be a global shift, but it's certainly an increasing shift in their thinking, which, I look at the survey, that's kind of, I feel good, because it looks like 75% at least of people agree with me, but their leadership doesn't. And the rhetoric that they hear and are going to hear for at least the next 2 years, if you hear it over and over again, people shift. And so my question is, how do you look at that in terms of what our, quote, allies, where they're heading? And
so I think that's a very important question. The survey doesn't get to that, but I do think that we are on the cusp of a very different kind of alignment led by the United States, and particularly by the president, which is a alignment of like-minded leaders, populist, nationalist, democratically elected. And you can see it with the Italians, the Hungarians, the Poles, now the Brazilians. And I do think there is a movement that Trump likely will seize on. For now, it's sort of not, he hasn't been strategic about it, but my sense is it's going to get more strategic to actively work to bring these leaders together and undermine the institutions that have, starting in Europe with the European Union, which the president has seen as an organization that is one German, created by Germany in order to defeat the United States on trade, which is a very strange history of the European Union. Mm-hmm. But he firmly believes that in his support for Brexit and everything else, including his support for the Italians, which will, I think, come up more and more in Europe and in Latin America. We had a speech by John Bolton just the other day about the troika of tyranny. Mm-hmm.
The troika of tyranny?
Yes.
That's got a ring to it.
Axis of evil had already been taken.
The axis of evil, we went from the axis to the troika of tyranny, these three major powers, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, that are going to undermine fundamentally the future of the world. The troika of tyranny. But I do think there is this potential realignment happening, and the politics in all of our democracies is becoming increasingly polarized. including in our own, as we just saw a couple of days ago, with extremes becoming more and more populated and popular.
Which is what's going to make this next phase so very, very interesting, because things are shifting all the time.
Yeah,
You've had your hand up in the second row with a tie. Yes.
Hello all. Thank you very much for being here, answering our questions, and giving the opinions. You mentioned that there's strong support among the American public for supporting allies. Then there's also low support for defending countries against foreign aggression. So among the major non-NATO allies, and I'm thinking particularly of the small Arabic countries like Tunisia or Kuwait, Bahrain, where do you think the American public would group them?
Well, I will
Too
just...
bad is what, they're out of luck, is where I think they are.
I think Americans are most inclined to support taking some kind of military action or defensive action if they sense a direct threat to either the United States, number one, or our allies. So I think a lot of it would depend on
Our treaty ally.
Yeah.
Major non-NATO
Our-
designated.
So yeah, unless there was some reason that, unless the messaging around the situation would make it clear why that would be something to threaten the United States, it would probably be hard. But it's a hypothetical, it's hard to say. A lot depends on the communication around the situation and how it affects Americans or our treaty allies.
It reminds me what Andrew Card, George W. Bush's chief of staff, said in August of 2002, when the issue was, would the Bush administration be able to persuade Americans that fighting in Iraq the next year was a good idea? And he said, you don't introduce a new product in the summer. Like, part of it is the marketing, the persuasiveness of the leadership of the United States, leading the people toward that desired goal, which actually brings me to a series of questions here, and it reminds me of what George Kennan said about popular opinion and foreign policy. He said, people don't actually know very much. He said, allowing foreign public opinion to influence foreign policy is like being in an operating theater and having the peanut gallery upstairs telling the surgeon, cut a little bit to the left. And so, but there's several really interesting questions.
Experts have revised that.
So there's several interesting questions here about the people who were surveyed. And so among the questions are, what if it had been likely voters, for example? What if it had been a more racially or ethnically diverse set of respondents? What if it had been people who actually don't have a college education? What can you say about who the survey includes?
Sure. The survey methodology is, I believe, on page 28. It's about 3 pages. It goes into a lot of detail. But basically what we survey are everyday Americans, whether they're voters or not voters. In our data set, we have how likely are you to vote, which isn't the greatest measure because people always exaggerate their likelihood to vote. But it's in there for researchers who want to do that. Our aim is to represent the American public as a whole. We do different kinds of analyses to look at different subsegments, but generally it is representative of the country's diverse character as well. This is based on, it's a random sample of Americans from across the country, and then the data are weighted according to education, age, race, ethnicity, things like that, so that they match the census. So it should be a microcosm, basically, of our country is in the data.
Final question, because I want to wrap up as promised. Let's say 2. One that I'm determined to ask. That'll be the very last question. How about you in the blue shirt? So we're really going to do 2 questions.
Hi, thank you for putting on this panel tonight. So I had a question about the survey in particular. The Pew Research Center just put out the results of a survey that they were looking at globally at the perceptions of the greatest threats facing the world. And they had found that international terrorism, which is reflected in this survey, and then also climate change, were often perceived to be the 2 largest. but climate change isn't reflected in this survey. Is that because you didn't find that concern, or just because you weren't able to ask about it in your survey?
We didn't ask about it this year because we alternate different years because we do the survey annually, but we asked it last year. And around the world, climate change is a big concern for every country but the United States and China, the biggest polluters. If you look at it by partisan breakdown and by age and ethnicity, there are big differences too. It's a very high priority for Democrats, not so much for Republicans.
Finally, and then we'll have to wrap up, I'm sorry to say, because I feel as though we could talk about each one of these issues for a long time. We have such a great panel. We have seen, particularly since November 2016, certainly Donald Trump supporters who put him so passionately into office, and since then, the resistance. We have seen strong efforts on both sides of the partisan divide to drive policy, to put leaders forward. And I'm just wondering whether you can envision moments where public opinion is going to drive foreign policy in the same way, or is it always likely to kind of take second? Take sort of the second seat to the leaders who will determine foreign policy.
I don't know that we
Do you need a big issue? Is that what it is?
I don't know that you would want public opinion to take the first seat. It should be one, because most Americans aren't experts on foreign policy, and a lot of people get news from questionable sources too. So. But you would want it to be an aspect of decision making. I mean, when I worked for the State Department, I worked conducting polls abroad, and we didn't always know how much weight was given to public opinion abroad. However, if the administration was thinking about conducting airstrikes, they definitely wanted to know how the public on the ground was going to view this, again, because they needed to figure out their communication strategies. So yeah, I think it should be a part, and it also depends on what, like how much is this particular policy going to affect an individual American too.
You know, I think with the increasing salience of interdomestic issues, and I would put trade and global economic issues and immigration at the top of that list, I think, public opinion is going to be naturally engaged with that. I have to say on some of the other issues, I'm of two minds on Dina's expert inclinations. On the one hand, as an aspiring expert, I'd love to have foreign policy, particularly some of the complex issues decided in the seminar room or, in the Council on Foreign Relations or the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, very nice conference room upstairs. On the other hand, though, I think we know that even foreign policy and national security policy is an intensely political process. And so, thinking that we can wonk our way out of a lot of big problems ignores the reality that politics is thoroughly infused in the warp and woof of all of these issues. And you sort of hope that, like in the case of the Iran nuclear deal, that common sense will weigh out. But on the other hand, it was an intensely political issue, and it remains an intensely political issue. And maybe the solution has got to be found in politics, not at the IAEA.
Well, and Bruce Dennelson has written about this, that policymakers put forth their policy, public opinion reacts. Policymakers then sometimes adjust, then the policy reacts. So it's an ongoing process of trying to take both into account.
Eva, do you have a last thought for us tonight?
Yeah, I was taught by my dad, who was in front of the classroom for 40-some years, what I thought a very useful way of thinking about students, which was the same as the public, which is never overestimate how much people know, never underestimate how much they understand. And I think that's true for the American public in foreign policy. It's why populism, that is direct democracy, is not such a good thing. But representative democracy is a really good thing. And so on foreign policy issues, as on domestic issues, and I think as the two become more and more linked, it is very important that our leaders spend time thinking about what it is and how to articulate their cases, learn from the public as they interact with it, and then make that part of their engagement, rather than having decisions made directly. I mean, we have just seen, not in the United States, but in Great Britain, one of the great experiments of what can go wrong when you do direct democracy. Never ask the people to make a fundamental decision on whether or not you should belong to a highly complicated international economic and political institution like the European Union without telling them what the consequences are of their choices, which is exactly what happened with the referendum. And I think referenda as such tend to be difficult ways to make fundamentally big decisions. But representative democracy and holding people to the fire, and remember, whether it was Vietnam or the Iraq War, that changed our politics in very fundamental ways. And by the way, in the ways it should. When our leaders make really, really, really bad mistakes, they ought to pay for it, and they usually do. And they don't do it through direct democracy, they do it through representative democracy, which is why it was so good, all of you, to have voted on Tuesday. At least I hope you did.
Well, thanks to all of you. I feel an awful lot smarter than I did an hour ago. So I appreciate that, and thank you all for coming.